Hong Kong, 1966. The elevator stopped between floors. There were 5 men inside. 2 of them had planned what would happen next. Bruce Lee never publicly described the incident. No police report was filed. No photographs surfaced. Yet 3 surviving witnesses, interviewed years later, told nearly identical versions of what happened in that narrow metal box. One of them, a junior lighting technician named Chan Wai-ming, would later say, he was not trapped. But for 3 seconds, he understood that he could be. 5 seconds after the doors closed, something happened that none of them had been taught in any class. And one of the men limped for months. But that was not the part that stayed with Bruce. What stayed with him was the decision. Hong Kong, 1966, Shaw Brothers Studio District. In early 1966, Bruce Lee was not yet an international icon. He was known locally as a former child actor, a promising martial arts instructor, and an unusually outspoken young man who had recently returned from the United States. He was 25 years old. Hong Kong's martial arts community at the time was not romantic. It was territorial. Different schools guarded techniques like trade secrets. Wing Chun, Choi Li Fut, Hung Gar, each system had lineages and loyalties. Foreign influence was viewed with suspicion. Bruce, having trained in Wing Chun under Ip Man but later modifying techniques and teaching non-Chinese students in America, had already disturbed traditionalists. He spoke openly about adaptation. He questioned rigid forms. He trained boxers and Westerners. That alone was enough to create friction. By mid-1966, Bruce had begun appearing on television in The Green Hornet, which aired in Hong Kong months after its American release. Though the show had been modest in the United States, in Hong Kong it made him recognizable. On screen, he moved with startling speed. Off-screen, rumors grew faster. Some said camera editing exaggerated his speed. Others claimed American stuntmen allowed him to look dominant. A few insisted he had abandoned true Chinese discipline for showmanship. The accusations were not shouted publicly. They moved quietly, through tea houses and training halls. One assistant director from Shaw Brothers, Leung Ka-yen, later recalled, he was admired. But also watched. The old teachers did not trust what he was becoming. Bruce had returned to Hong Kong temporarily in 1966 to visit family and explore work opportunities. He was not yet the film star he would later become. He was in between worlds, not fully American, not fully reabsorbed into the Hong Kong martial arts hierarchy. That liminal status mattered. He trained obsessively during this period. Witnesses describe him running through Kowloon before sunrise, practicing footwork in small spaces, experimenting with hand combinations that blended Western boxing guard with Wing Chun centerline theory. He carried tension in his shoulders, not fear, but anticipation. He understood he was being evaluated. At 5 feet 7 inches and approximately 135 pounds, he was not physically imposing by traditional standards. In a culture that respected lineage and visible seniority, Bruce represented something disruptive, speed over size, efficiency over ceremony. And he had begun privately expressing an opinion that some interpreted as arrogant, that most martial arts schools practiced patterns that would collapse under pressure. That belief would eventually evolve into jeet kune do. But in 1966, it was still forming, raw, experimental, unprotected. Challenges during this period were not unusual. They were rarely formalized. Sometimes they were disguised as friendly exchanges. Other times, they were orchestrated tests. What made this particular incident different was location. An elevator is not a training hall. There is no space to retreat. No room to circle. No audience to applaud. Just metal walls and breath. According to Chan Wai-ming, the lighting technician who would later recount the event, the tension that day did not begin inside the elevator. It began in the hallway, with 2 men who had already decided something needed to be proven. And Bruce understood that before the doors closed. The men in the elevator were not there by accident. According to Chan Weiming and another witness, prop assistant Ho Tin Fu, the primary challenger was a man named Lau Kwok-sing. Lau was in his early 30s, roughly 6 feet tall, and built like a gymnasium wall, broad shoulders, heavy chest, arms thick from decades of Muay Thai and unarmed street combat. He was known among underground circles in Kowloon for enforcing debts and testing fighters. He carried reputation, scars, and an aura that suggested he had survived more fights than anyone wanted to count. The second man, unnamed by witnesses but described as shorter, wiry, and equally disciplined, was clearly Lau's associate, an enforcer or backup. His role was to corner, pressure, and ensure Bruce could not escape. Both men were silent and tense, they did not speak more than a few words to each other. Bruce would later recount, in a private interview with a friend decades later, that their silence was part of the threat, it made it immediate, cold, and inescapable. Why they confronted Bruce is partially conjecture, but the witnesses and studio staff confirmed that Lau had been circulating complaints about Bruce's approach to martial arts. Some traditionalists considered him a threat to the established hierarchy. Others were personally offended that a foreign-returned fighter could train American students in Hong Kong. Lau, according to witnesses, had made a decision that Bruce needed to be tested physically, to prove whether his speed, efficiency, and unorthodox techniques were legitimate or exaggerated. It was not a publicity stunt. No cameras, no posters, no news crews. It was deliberately private, in the echoing corridors of Shaw Brothers' studio, in a back hall where the elevators rarely stopped. Witnesses describe Lau as calculating. He studied Bruce immediately. One account recalls, he looked him over like a man checking if a knife would cut metal, and not if, but how. Ho Tin Fu. The threat was real because Lau had fought seriously in real contests, unsanctioned, and survived. He understood pain, leverage, and timing. Bruce, though skilled, had never faced a challenge with such clear stakes. This was a test of survival as much as skill. Another factor made Lau credible, he had size, training, and experience on his side. Bruce could not rely on speed alone in a confined space. Witnesses later described how Bruce's awareness shifted instantly upon entering the elevator, his usual strategies were insufficient. The psychological pressure was immediate, and unlike in a studio or training hall, the space offered no room to readjust after a failed move. This was a confrontation that demanded precision, not display. Lau's eyes, described by Chan as calculating, unblinking, like measuring an opponent as if he were an object, created tension in the metal box that compounded Bruce's awareness. Every muscle contracted preemptively. Every subtle movement was noticed. The stakes were not fame, or approval, or revenge. The stakes were control, survival, and moral choice, a test both of skill and of restraint. Bruce was not a stranger to danger. But in this moment, cornered by two experienced, deliberate fighters, he understood something few witnesses reported: skill alone might not suffice. One misstep could end in real injury. The challenge was no longer theoretical. The confrontation occurred on a humid afternoon in July 1966, inside Shaw Brothers' Studio Building 3, on the back elevator servicing the sound stages. Witnesses emphasized that the space itself was a factor as critical as the men inside it. The elevator measured barely 6 feet wide by 5 feet deep, the ceiling low enough to force any fighter to keep their centerline compact. Chan Weiming, the junior lighting technician, described stepping in moments before the doors closed. There was no room to step back. You could barely raise your arms fully without brushing the walls. The air was hot, stale from the day's filming, and every breath felt heavier as soon as the doors shut. The conditions amplified tension. This was no sparring ring. No padded mat to absorb mistakes. No referee to intervene. A slip, a misplaced strike, could result in a cracked skull against the metal panel or a broken wrist from impact with the elevator's frame. Witness setup was sparse. Chan and Ho Tin Fu were coincidentally inside the elevator at the time, along with a maintenance worker and a visiting stagehand. None were expecting confrontation. All were pressed close to the walls, instinctively moving back into corners, attempting to minimize their exposure. Their presence added a subtle psychological pressure. Bruce and Lau were aware of eyes watching, but the focus remained absolute: movement, distance, and control. There were no formal rules. Witnesses insist that the men did not shake hands, did not bow, and did not speak challenges aloud. Lau made one brief gesture with his right hand, an almost imperceptible flick of his wrist, which Bruce interpreted instantly. It was a signal. The first exchange would determine spacing and immediate threat assessment. The elevator itself created constraints that influenced strategy. With walls pressing in on all sides, Bruce could not utilize wide arcs, spinning kicks, or evasive lateral footwork. Each technique had to be compressed, controlled, and precise. There was no room for overextension. For Lau, who relied on size and reach, the elevator reduced the effectiveness of brute force but emphasized the impact of close-range control. Witnesses recalled the emotional atmosphere as nearly suffocating. Chun described the rising tension with unusual clarity. You could hear the subtle tightening of muscles, and smell sweat before anyone moved. Even breathing felt deliberate. Bruce's hands, they weren't shaking, but they weren't relaxed either. Lau's eyes never left him. It felt like time slowed inside those walls. The psychological edge rested as much on spatial dominance as on skill. Bruce recognized he had to neutralize reach and weight advantage while maintaining precise timing. Lau, in contrast, knew that his height and mass could intimidate, but in the metal box, intimidation alone would not suffice. Physical factors compounded the danger. A misstep could crush toes against the door, or a head knock against the elevator panel could end the fight before it began. Each micro-movement, each shift of weight, became a statement. Every reaction was magnified. The stakes escalated before any strike was thrown. By the moment the doors sealed, the elevator had become more than metal walls. It was a crucible, limited space, untrained witnesses pressed near, and two men intent on testing Bruce's capability. The claustrophobic conditions ensured that neither participant could escape the reality of immediate consequences. The tension inside the elevator was not merely physical. It was moral and psychological. Bruce knew that in this confined space, his next move could decisively injure someone, or himself. He understood the inherent danger of fighting someone not only larger but willing to exploit the environment. And he understood, acutely, that restraint might be as difficult to maintain as the fight itself. The first strike came almost instantly after Bruce shifted his weight into a ready stance. Witnesses later described it not as a flurry, but as a measured, razor-focused opening, an experiment in timing and control. Lau moved first, a low, deliberate step forward, attempting to test Bruce's reaction. He raised his right forearm, aiming a short elbow strike toward Bruce's torso, fast, compact, and heavy enough to dent ribs if landed cleanly in such confined quarters. The elevator walls amplified every movement, there was no margin for error. Bruce pivoted sharply on the balls of his feet, redirecting his torso just enough to absorb the force against his shoulder, not his ribs. The impact made a dull thud against his serratus muscles. Pain flickered, but it was controlled. Witness Chan Weiming recalled the sensation of watching the encounter from the corner. Everything seemed slowed down. You could see him, Bruce, adjust his angle after that first hit. Not flinching, but calculating. Lau's elbow had weight behind it, and yet, he moved through it. Bruce countered with a subtle lead-hand strike, aiming at Lau's jawline. It was not a knockout blow, the goal was space and feedback. His knuckles made contact with Lau's cheekbone, forcing a small backward step. Lau's body absorbed it, flexing and twisting to dissipate the energy, his feet scrabbling for purchase against the elevator floor. The precision required in this space was immense. Too much force could crush a rib, too little would leave him vulnerable. The secondary man, the wiry associate, attempted to press Bruce from the side. He threw a short hook punch toward Bruce's ribs. Bruce pivoted his torso, allowing the strike to slide along his body without breaking balance. Every movement was choreographed instinctively, foot adjustment, torso rotation, micro-shifts of hand positioning. Witnesses noted how his center of gravity remained unerringly stable despite the confining walls. But control was tenuous. Physical realism became brutal in confined space. Bruce's wrist absorbed a glancing impact against the elevator wall when he moved to avoid a low kick from Lau. A sharp ache radiated up his forearm, reminding him, as he would later tell a friend, that even minor errors had consequences. The first exchange concluded with Bruce subtly reversing momentum. Lau, expecting a heavier, slower strike from the smaller man, was momentarily off balance. Bruce used that instant to create separation, less than a foot, but enough to breathe and recalibrate. Chun, still pressed to the corner, recalled, "It was not a victory. But you could feel the shift. The air changed." Bruce had made the first statement, he could respond, and he would not be pinned. The first exchange demonstrated several key truths: speed alone would not carry Bruce, control and precision were paramount, even slight miscalculations could result in serious injury. The elevator walls became active participants, shaping each action and reaction. By the end of the first few seconds, both men were visibly aware of each other's skill. Lau's mass and reach were mitigated by Bruce's compact movements. Bruce's smaller frame forced him to operate with compressed techniques, each strike a measured negotiation of distance, timing, and impact. Yet psychologically, the tension escalated. Bruce knew he had temporarily stabilized the encounter, but the moral question was pressing: one overcommitted strike could cripple, one misjudged kick could end the fight violently. And in this claustrophobic space, the stakes were immediate and unforgiving. The air was thick with anticipation. Sweat began to glisten along Bruce's temples and Lau's forehead. Every muscle was coiled. Each man had registered the other's capability, and now the fight had truly begun. By the midpoint of the confrontation, the stakes inside the elevator had escalated beyond technical skill. The confined space amplified each movement, each breath, each micro-adjustment of weight. Bruce's small size and Lau's mass were now fully at odds, creating a tension that was both physical and moral. Lau pressed forward aggressively, swinging his right arm in a tight arc toward Bruce's head. The impact carried real force, enough to snap a nose or fracture a jaw if unblocked. Bruce shifted on the balls of his feet, angling slightly to the side and twisting his torso just enough to redirect the blow toward his shoulder. The contact jolted him, and for the first time in the encounter, he felt the sting of potential injury, a sharp pain radiating across his trapezius. At the same time, Lau's associate lunged from the side with a low sweep aimed at Bruce's ankle. The maneuver was subtle but calculated. If successful, it could unbalance him entirely. Bruce reacted instantaneously, lifting his leg and countering with a brief, precise knee strike, not intended to break bones, but to maintain equilibrium. His knuckles grazed Lau's forearm as he shifted, leaving a small red mark that would later be visible to Chun. The psychological weight of the moment grew heavier. Bruce realized that any misstep could seriously injure either opponent, or himself. He was no longer dealing with controlled drills or predictable opponents. This was a fight in which restraint mattered as much as execution. Every strike was a moral decision: inflict maximum damage and end it quickly, or control the outcome and survive with both integrity and safety intact. Witnesses recall that Bruce's face betrayed the internal conflict. Chun Weiming said, "I could see his jaw tense. Not fear, not hesitation, but a kind of recognition. He knew exactly how dangerous it could get, and he had to decide whether to push it or hold back." The turning point came when Lau misjudged a backward step. Bruce seized the moment, delivering a rapid, controlled series of hand strikes aimed at the ribs and shoulders, enough to force him back into the elevator wall. The sound of impact, the dull thud of flesh against metal, echoed briefly. Lau faltered but did not collapse. The blow was precise, intended to create space and regain control, not to maim. It was in this moment that Bruce confronted the moral decision. The immediate physical advantage tempted him to escalate, but he recognized the consequences. One overcommitted strike could permanently disable the man he was facing. He slowed, shifted his stance, and recalibrated, his strikes now measured to neutralize without breaking bones. The associate, sensing the shift, attempted a feint from the right, forcing Bruce into a tighter rotation than ideal. Bruce's foot scraped against the elevator floor, the metal groaned slightly under pressure. He countered, twisting his wrist and redirecting a potential blow, but the stress was evident. A faint sheen of blood appeared on his knuckle from contact with Lau's elbow. The space left no room for mistakes. Emotionally, Bruce's composure cracked briefly. A flash of frustration and awareness of vulnerability crossed his face. It was not fear of defeat, he had skill, but fear of unintended consequences. The ethical dimension of violence, rarely acknowledged in training, had become immediate. He understood that controlling the fight was as important as winning. Chun later recalled the tension, you could feel it in the air. Not the kind of tension you get in a fight scene. This was real. Every strike mattered. Every movement had consequence. In the 5 minutes that followed, Bruce maintained control through a combination of precision strikes, angle management, and micro-adjustments of force. He neutralized attacks without delivering crippling damage. The fight tested his endurance, skill, and moral restraint simultaneously. By the time the elevator began its descent, both men had recognized the limits of the encounter. Lau's breathing was heavy, his pride intact but his dominance questioned. Bruce's own awareness had sharpened, not just of physical technique, but of the psychological and ethical dimensions of confrontation. The moral decision had been made, the strongest move would have been destructive, but Bruce chose restraint, and in doing so, he preserved the line between skill and harm. When the elevator doors finally opened on the 5th floor, the encounter ended almost as quietly as it had begun. No one cheered. No one laughed. Bruce, Lau, and his associate stepped out, each measuring the other with lingering awareness. The confined metal box had been more than a test of martial skill, it had become a crucible for judgment, ethics, and survival. Lau walked away with a bruised shoulder and a faint red mark along his forearm. It was not enough to require medical attention, but it was a visible reminder of Bruce's precision. Witness Ho Tin Fu recalled, he limped slightly, not from fear, but from realizing how much he had miscalculated. He respected Bruce after that. You could see it in the way he held himself, silent, careful. Bruce, meanwhile, carried the ache in his shoulder and a faint abrasion on his knuckle. More importantly, he carried the weight of what had nearly happened. Witnesses emphasized that he did not smile afterward, nor did he celebrate. Chun noted, he looked at the walls, at the space, like he had understood something deeper than skill. Something about control, and about how easily it could be lost. The incident remained unreported publicly. Studio management treated it as a private disagreement, a matter of hallway tension. No cameras recorded it, no newspapers covered it, and Bruce never spoke about it in interviews. Yet those who witnessed it would carry the memory for decades. The moment etched itself into the consciousness of those present, not as spectacle, but as a lesson in the dangerous intersection of skill, space, and moral choice. For Bruce, the experience reinforced principles that would inform his later philosophy of martial arts. Speed and precision were essential, but they were insufficient without awareness of consequence. He understood acutely that every move had potential for irreversible damage. This understanding shaped not only his technique but the careful psychological conditioning of his students, emphasizing decision-making under stress rather than the mere demonstration of power. Lau, by contrast, carried a quiet respect for the man he had attempted to test. He rarely spoke of the encounter publicly. When pressed years later by Chun, he acknowledged, he could have broken me easily. But he did not. That mattered. The witnesses, Chun and Ho, described the moment as frozen in memory. It was the kind of event that did not require embellishment, the intensity, risk, and human stakes were self-evident. They recalled the elevator's metal walls, the close air, the tension coiling in every muscle. They recalled Bruce's decision, to confront skill with control, strength with restraint. Ultimately, the encounter remained unrecorded in history books, unseen in public archives, but it shaped Bruce's understanding of combat, responsibility, and human capacity. The strongest man in the room was not the one who could dominate physically. It was the one who knew exactly how much damage he chose not to inflict. And in that elevator, in July of 1966, Bruce Lee faced that choice, and survived both the men and the consequences of restraint.